The first sign that something was wrong came the moment our helicopter broke through the wall of swirling snow. Glacier Point Research Station squatted against the endless white expanse like a dark insect, its metal walls already disappearing under fresh layers of frost. I pressed my face against the helicopter's window, watching as we descended toward what would be my home for the next 6 months. "Beautiful, isn't it?" Dr. James Morrison had to shout over the roar of the rotors. His salt and pepper beard couldn't hide his excited grin. As the lead researcher at the station, he'd been the one to personally request my transfer here. "Just wait until you see what we found in the ice cores, Dr. Parker." I nodded, but something about the station's silhouette made my stomach clench. Maybe it was the way the main building's sharp angles jutted against the pristine landscape, or how the light catching the solar arrays created strange, shifting patterns across the snow. Whatever it was, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I'm Dr. Emily Parker, and I've spent the last decade studying deep-sea organisms. When the opportunity came to join the Glacier Point team and their groundbreaking research into marine life patterns beneath the Arctic ice, I jumped at the chance. The station's isolation, 200 miles from the nearest town, didn't bother me. I'd done remote work before, but as our helicopter touched down on the landing pad, sending up clouds of powder, I realized this was different. The nearest help was hours away by air, and during the winter storms, even that lifeline would be cut off. The wind hit me like a physical wall as I stepped onto the landing pad. Through the swirling snow, I could make out 4 figures waiting by the station's main entrance. Dr. Morrison grabbed my arm, helping me stay upright as we hurried toward them. "Welcome to the edge of the world," he shouted over the wind. "Let me introduce you to the team." The first person to step forward was Dr. Yuki Tanaka, our glaciologist. Her handshake was firm, her smile genuine beneath her heavy hood. Next was Dr. Michael Rodriguez, the marine geologist, who gave a friendly wave but seemed distracted by something on his tablet. Anna Thompson, our communications specialist, quickly ushered us inside, while David Wilson, the station engineer, grabbed my bags. The station's airlock hissed as it sealed behind us, cutting off the howling wind. As we removed our heavy outer gear, I noticed the first equipment malfunction. The internal temperature display was flickering between numbers, unable to settle on a reading. "Don't worry about that," David said, following my gaze. "Been acting up for a few days now. I'll have it fixed by tomorrow." He wouldn't. That night, as I lay in my narrow bunk listening to the wind batter the station's walls, I heard something else, a low, rhythmic humming coming from somewhere deep below the ice. When I mentioned it the next morning, Dr. Morrison's eyes lit up with an enthusiasm that I would later recognize as the first warning sign. "That's why you're here, Emily," he said, leading me toward the research labs. "We're on the verge of something extraordinary, the ice. It's not as lifeless as we thought." The problem started small. 3 weeks into my stay, I was reviewing data from our deep ice sensors when the computer screen flickered and died. By the time I got David to look at it, everything was working normally again, but that was just the beginning. Anna was the first to notice the communication issues. "The satellite link keeps dropping," she announced during breakfast one morning. "And it's not the weather. The system shows perfect conditions, but the signal, it's like something's interfering with it." Dr. Tanaka, Yuki, shared a concerned look with me across the table. We were already running low on some supplies after the last helicopter had been forced to turn back due to a sudden storm. If we couldn't maintain reliable communications. But it was the ice cores that first made me realize something was truly wrong. I was helping Michael catalog the latest samples when I noticed them. Strange markings unlike anything I'd seen in my years of research. They looked almost like scratch marks, but that was impossible at the depths we were pulling from. "Michael," I called him over, "have you ever seen anything like this?" He frowned, adjusting his glasses as he peered at the core. "That's new. Dr. Morrison should see this." But when we brought it to Morrison's attention, his reaction was odd. Instead of surprise, I saw something like recognition flash across his face before he quickly composed himself. "Document everything," he said, his voice tight. "But keep this between us for now. We don't want to jump to conclusions." The dogs knew something was wrong before any of us. The station kept a small team of huskies for emergency transport if needed. Usually, they were the most reliable early warning system for incoming storms, but something else was spooking them now. I was working late one night when I heard them start howling, not their usual excited barks, but long, mournful sounds that made the hair on my neck stand up. When I went to check on them, I found them all huddled at the back of their enclosure, as far from the station's outer wall as they could get. Their eyes reflected my flashlight beam like yellow coins, and none of them would respond to my calls. The temperature readings were the next impossibility. Our sensors below the ice were showing variations that defied physics. Rapid swings of 20 or 30 degrees in areas that should have been thermally stable. David spent days recalibrating the equipment, but the readings persisted. "It doesn't make sense," he muttered, showing me the data logs. "It's like something down there is generating heat, but that's impossible at these depths." The final supply helicopter of the season was scheduled for December 1st. We'd all been looking forward to it. Fresh food, mail from home, new equipment to replace some of our malfunctioning gear. But as the date approached, so did the storm. We watched helplessly as the satellite imagery showed a massive system moving in, bringing winds that would make any flight impossible. The last radio transmission from the pilot was apologetic, but firm. "Sorry folks, no way we can make it through this one. You'll have to hold out until the weather breaks in spring." None of us knew then that the storm was just the beginning. That soon, being cut off from the outside world would be the least of our problems. I found the old logs by accident. I was searching through the station's archives for historical temperature data when I came across a folder labeled simply 1982. Inside were dozens of reports from the previous research team, the last team to occupy Glacier Point before it was abandoned for nearly 2 decades. The similarities were impossible to ignore: equipment failures, strange readings from beneath the ice, and then, near the end, increasingly frantic entries about movement in the samples and biological impossibilities. The final entry was dated December 28, 1982. "Something is alive down there, not just microorganisms. Something old, something that's been waiting. God help us, I think it's waking up." The entire team had vanished without a trace. The official report blamed a storm, suggested they'd tried to reach the emergency shelter and got lost in the whiteout conditions. But I knew now that wasn't true. Something else had happened here, and we were starting to follow the same path. The breakthrough, or the beginning of the end, came during routine analysis of our deep ice cores. Michael was the first to spot it. Tiny, dark shapes suspended in the ancient ice. Under the microscope, they looked like nothing we'd ever seen before. Complex, cellular structures that seemed to defy classification. But it was what happened next that changed everything. As the ice melted under the microscope's lights, the organisms began to move. "This is impossible," Yuki whispered, staring at the screen. "These samples are from ice that's been frozen for millions of years. Nothing could survive that." But they had survived, and they were active. Dr. Morrison's reaction to the discovery was strange. While the rest of us were shocked, he seemed almost expectant. He immediately took charge of the samples, setting up a separate containment lab that only he had access to. "We need to be careful," he insisted. "This could be the most important discovery in human history. We can't risk contamination." I should have recognized the gleam in his eyes for what it was, not just scientific curiosity, but obsession. He began spending longer and longer hours in the lab, sometimes not emerging for days at a time. When he did appear, he looked haggard, his skin pale and clammy under the fluorescent lights. "Are you all right?" I asked him one evening, catching him as he stumbled toward his quarters. "You should rest." He grabbed my arm, his grip surprisingly strong. "You don't understand," he said, his eyes fever bright. "They're perfect, Emily, perfect. Do you know what this means for evolution, for humanity?" I pulled away, unsettled by his intensity. "What exactly have you found?" But he just smiled, a strange, secretive expression, and hurried away. That night, I snuck into the main lab and examined the original samples ourselves. What I found made my blood run cold. The organisms weren't just surviving in the melted ice, they were multiplying, and they were changing. December 15th brought darkness and chaos. The storm hit without warning, a howling beast that made the station's metal walls shriek in protest. Wind speeds quickly reached 120 miles per hour, transforming the familiar Arctic landscape into a writhing white void. "We've lost contact with the outside world," Anna announced grimly from her communications station. "All frequencies are dead." The power fluctuations started next. The lights would dim, flicker, and sometimes cut out entirely for minutes at a time. During one of these blackouts, I heard something that made my heart stop. A sound like massive chunks of ice shifting far below the station, followed by what could almost have been a low, rumbling growl. "It's just the storm," Michael insisted when I mentioned it, but I noticed he wouldn't meet my eyes. David spent hours checking the backup generator only to deliver more bad news. "Something's wrong with the mechanical components," he reported during our emergency meeting. "It's like something's been eating away at the metal." "That's impossible," Yuki said, but her voice wavered. The storm raged for 3 days. We took turns watching the structural integrity monitors, praying the station would hold. But it wasn't the wind that frightened me most. It was the other sounds, the ones that seemed to be getting closer. The monitoring equipment in the deep ice lab picked them up first, strange frequencies that didn't match any known geological activity. When we analyzed the recordings, they showed patterns that were almost rhythmic, almost like language. "Turn it off," Anna suddenly demanded when we played the recording. She was pressing her hands against her ears, her face pale. "Please, just turn it off. It's giving me a headache." She wasn't the only one. We all started experiencing splitting headaches that no amount of medication could touch. They were worst at night, when the sounds from below seemed loudest. During one of the power outages, I could have sworn I saw something moving in the darkness of the lab, a shape darker than the blackness around it, sliding along the wall like oil. When the lights came back on, there was nothing there, except a strange, glistening trail on the floor that evaporated before I could collect a sample. Morrison was oddly calm throughout the storm, while the rest of us huddled in the common area, listening to the station groan around us. He continued his work in the containment lab. Sometimes we could hear him talking to himself, his words muffled by the thick doors. "Someone needs to talk to him," Michael said on the third night. "This isn't normal." But none of us did. Perhaps we were all too afraid of what we might find. It was during one of my sleepless nights that I first decided to review the security footage. With the storm still raging outside and sleep impossible, I thought I might as well organize our research data. The security camera feeds were supposed to be a minor part of that task. I wasn't prepared for what I found. The station had 16 cameras in total, covering everything from the main labs to the external entrances. I started with the previous week's footage, fast-forwarding through hours of normal activity. At first, I almost missed them, the shadows. They appeared in the background of various feeds, always just at the edge of the frame, dark shapes that seemed to move independently of any light source, flowing across walls and ceilings like living ink. When I slowed the footage down, they disappeared, visible only at normal speed, as if they existed in the spaces between moments. But it was the footage from 3:15 a.m. 3 days ago that made me question everything. The camera covering the specimen storage showed Dr. Morrison entering, his movements jerky and unnatural. He punched in his access code and disappeared inside. I waited for him to exit, but he never did. I switched to the camera inside the storage room, but the footage showed only empty space. Morrison was nowhere to be seen. Switching between feeds revealed no sign of him leaving the room through any other exit. He had simply vanished. When I confronted him the next morning, his response chilled me to the bone. "That's impossible," he said, not looking up from his microscope. "I was asleep in my quarters all night. Check the footage if you don't believe me." I did check. The camera outside his quarters showed him sleeping peacefully at exactly the same time he was entering the specimen storage. Both feeds were time-stamped and showed no signs of tampering. Over the next few days, the cameras began failing one by one. First, the external feeds went dark, which David attributed to the storm. Then the lab cameras started showing only static. Eventually, only the cameras in the main corridors remained functional. But before they failed, they caught something else. Reviewing the footage late one night, I noticed that during the brief power outages, the night vision mode would activate. In those green-tinted moments, I could see something moving through the labs. The shapes were almost human, but wrong, too fluid, too smooth. And sometimes, just for a frame or two, they would look directly at the camera with eyes that reflected like polished mirrors. I thought about deleting the footage. Sometimes I wish I had. But we needed evidence of what was happening here, even if no one would believe it. So instead I began copying the files to an encrypted drive, documenting everything I could. The last camera failed on December 20th. Its final frame showed a dark figure standing in the corridor outside my quarters, its head tilted at an impossible angle. When I zoomed in on its face, I saw features that looked eerily like Morrison's, but distorted, as if seen through rippling water. We were now truly blind to what was moving through the station's shadows, but perhaps that was a mercy. Some things, once seen, can never be unseen. The changes in Dr. Morrison became impossible to ignore. It started with his skin, a subtle shift in color that made him look almost waxy under the fluorescent lights. When questioned, he blamed it on lack of sunlight, but I had wintered in research stations before. This was something else. His eyes were next. I first noticed it during a team meeting when he turned to address Yuki. His pupils seemed to ripple like dark water disturbed by a stone. He must have seen me staring because he abruptly excused himself, nearly knocking over his chair in his haste to leave. "Did anyone else see that?" I whispered after he left, but the others were already experiencing their own problems. The headaches had become unbearable. Anna spent most of her time in her quarters with the lights off. Michael complained of sensitivity to light so severe he had to wear sunglasses indoors. Only Yuki seemed relatively unaffected, but I noticed she had stopped eating with the rest of us. I found Morrison's research notes by accident while looking for missing lab samples. The pages were filled with disturbing drawings, twisted human forms merging with something alien and fluid. Between the sketches were fragments of text, growing increasingly erratic. The physical laws we understand are a joke. Evolution didn't stop, we just couldn't see its true path. In the deepest ice, in the darkest depths, it continued. Perfect adaptation, perfect survival, perfect union. They speak to me through the microscope, through the walls, through my blood. They show me what we could become. The most disturbing page was dated just 3 days ago. The change is beautiful. The cold doesn't hurt anymore. Nothing hurts anymore. Soon the others will understand. Soon they'll see what I've seen, what I've become. I photographed everything before carefully returning the notebook. That night, I heard strange noises coming from Morrison's lab. A wet, slithering sound, followed by what might have been laughter, but distorted, like it was coming from underwater. The station's temperature control system failed the next day. David found the main control unit covered in a strange, oily residue that seemed to eat through his gloves when he tried to clean it. The temperature began to fluctuate wildly, 1 hour unbearably hot, the next cold enough to see our breath. "Something's growing in the ventilation system," David reported, his voice shaking. "Something organic." We sealed off the affected sections, but we all knew it was too late. Whatever was in the vents was already spreading through the station, and through us. Anna's collapse marked the beginning of the end. We found her unconscious at her communications station, her skin burning hot despite the freezing temperature in the room. When we tried to move her to the medical bay, I noticed something moving beneath her skin, like ripples passing through water. "We need to implement quarantine protocols," Yuki insisted, already pulling on a hazmat suit. "Whatever this is, it's spreading." We converted the East Wing into an isolation ward, but it quickly became clear that traditional medical procedures were useless against what was happening. Anna's condition deteriorated rapidly. Her fever reached impossible temperatures, yet she shivered constantly, begging us to make it warmer. Through the observation window, we watched in horror as her transformation accelerated. Her skin became translucent, revealing shadowy movements underneath. Her eyes began to change, the irises expanding until they consumed the whites, becoming reflective like dark mirrors. Michael was next to show symptoms, though his manifestation was different. He began sleepwalking, and security footage showed him making his way to the specimen storage each night, though he had no memory of it in the morning. When we locked the doors, he became agitated, clawing at the walls until his fingers bled. I spent every waking hour in the makeshift lab we'd set up outside the quarantine zone, studying tissue samples and blood work. What I found defied everything I thought I knew about biology. The ancient organisms weren't just surviving in human tissue, they were reshaping it, rebuilding it from the inside out. Under the microscope, I watched human cells dissolve and reform into something else, something that could survive in conditions that would kill any terrestrial life form. The implications were staggering. This wasn't just an infection, it was forced evolution driven by an intelligence far older than humanity. Morrison appeared at odd hours to observe the quarantined team members, pressing his hands against the observation glass. I noticed he no longer wore protective gear, and his skin had taken on a strange, shifting quality like oil on water. On December 23rd, Morrison disappeared completely. The last security footage showed him walking into his private lab at 2:47 a.m. The camera caught a brief glimpse of what waited for him inside, a mass of writhing darkness that seemed to reach for him as the door closed. We never saw him again, at least not in any form we could recognize as human. Breaking into Morrison's private computer files took hours. David helped me bypass the encryption, his hands shaking as he typed. What we found confirmed our worst fears, and revealed horrors we hadn't even imagined. Morrison had been experimenting on himself from the beginning. His research logs documented his transformation in clinical detail. Day 1, first direct exposure to thawed specimen, burning sensation at contact site, heightened awareness of environmental vibrations. Day 7, cellular reconstruction proceeding faster than anticipated. Can feel them moving through my bloodstream. The pain is excruciating but necessary. Day 15, the cold no longer affects me, can maintain core body temperature in sub-zero conditions without protection. Their consciousness is becoming clearer. They show me things, such beautiful things in the dark. The video files were worse. Hidden cameras in his private lab recorded everything. We watched in horror as Morrison systematically infected himself with the ancient organisms, documenting his body's gradual transformation into something that barely resembled human. But the true revelation came in his final entries. He had found records from the 1982 team, not just the official logs, but personal journals and sealed specimens. They had discovered the same organisms, conducted similar experiments, and they had transformed too. They never disappeared. Morrison's last entry read, "They evolved, adapted, became something greater, the perfect form for this environment. And now it's happening again. The cycle continues. We are becoming what we were always meant to be." Attached to the entry was security footage from 1982, showing the final hours of the previous team. The images were grainy, but clear enough to see human figures melting, flowing together, becoming something else entirely, something that slithered away into the ice, leaving the station empty but not abandoned. Never abandoned, just waiting. The truth changed everything. We weren't just fighting an infection. We were fighting an intelligence that had waited millions of years to be found, and it was winning. I worked desperately in the lab, looking for any weakness in the organism's structure. The transformation seemed to accelerate in warm temperatures, which gave me an idea. If heat helped them thrive, then perhaps extreme cold. The temperature, I explained to Yuki, who was still showing no signs of transformation. They can survive being frozen, but active transformation requires heat. If we can lower the station temperature enough, we'll freeze to death, she finished quietly. Maybe, but we'll die human. The choice was made for us when Michael broke out of quarantine. We found Anna's observation room empty as well, the reinforced window shattered outward. Something that looked like frozen mercury dragged itself across the floor, leaving iridescent trails that pulsed with bioluminescence. David volunteered to override the station's environmental controls. The manual override is in the maintenance tunnels, he explained, already pulling on his cold weather gear. Once I shut down the heating system, you'll have maybe an hour before hypothermia sets in. Make it count. He never came back. We heard his screams echoing through the ventilation system, followed by sounds that could have been either tearing metal or tearing flesh. The temperature plummeted. Ice crystals formed on the inside of the windows. Our breath came in white clouds that hung in the air like ghosts. The organisms in my tissue samples became sluggish, then dormant. But we weren't alone in the station. Things moved in the shadows, flowing, rippling shapes that used to be our colleagues. They were hunting us now, driven by an instinct older than humanity itself. And they were learning to adapt to the cold. In the end, only Yuki and I remained fully human. We had no choice but to try for the emergency shelter 2 miles from the station. With the transformed crew members hunting us through the station, staying meant eventual assimilation. "We'll never make it in this visibility," Yuki said, peering through the window at the swirling snow outside. The storm hadn't let up for days. "We can't stay here," I replied, checking the straps on my Arctic survival gear one last time. "The cold isn't stopping them anymore, it's just slowing them down." The plan was simple: reach the emergency shelter, barricade ourselves inside, and use its radio to call for help. The shelter was stocked with enough supplies to last months. If we could make it there, we might survive until spring. We made our move at midday when the visibility was best. The moment we stepped outside, the wind hit us like a physical wall. The temperature was minus 60 degrees Fahrenheit with the wind chill, cold enough to freeze exposed flesh in seconds. We roped ourselves together and started walking, using a compass to navigate. The station disappeared behind us into the white void. For a few minutes, I dared to hope we might make it. Then we heard them coming. They moved through the snow like living mercury, their transformed bodies unaffected by the cold. I caught glimpses of familiar faces in their fluid forms. Morrison's eyes, Michael's profile, Anna's outline, before they dissolved back into rippling darkness. "Run," Yuki screamed, cutting the rope between us. Something dark and sinuous burst from the snow where she had been standing. I ran blindly through the storm, pursued by things that slithered and flowed through the white darkness. I don't know how I found the emergency shelter, luck maybe, or some remnant of our antagonist's memories guiding me. I sealed myself inside, activated the emergency beacon, and waited. That was 3 days ago. The radio crackles with static, but sometimes I hear voices in the white noise, familiar voices calling my name. The walls of the shelter creak and groan, and in the corners of my vision, I see shadows that shouldn't be there. My skin feels strange, tight. Sometimes when I look in the mirror, I swear I can see something moving beneath its surface. The rescue team will come eventually, but I'm no longer sure what they'll find when they do. The cold is starting to feel comfortable, and in the endless dark of the polar night, something ancient whispers of evolution, of transformation, of becoming something greater than human. I think I'm starting to understand what Morrison meant about perfect adaptation, perfect survival, perfect union.